Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So a few coming in still. I'm Andrew Satake Blavel, Director of Cranbrook Art Museum, and I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's presentation. I think you'll find it very illuminating and delightful, just like the work. And hopefully you'll have a chance to see the exhibition, which is upstairs in the North Gallery. Hopefully you checked it out, but we should have time at the end to go up and check it out. I will, so what will be happening, we'll have a talk and then a conversation, a short talk and a conversation between the artist and the curator of the exhibition. So by way of introduction, this exhibition is part of a series that we began at Cranbrook Art Museum 4 years ago called Fresh Paint. And what it is it features a Detroit-based artist, and I think it's true. I think it's true in all 4 cases so far that this was their first solo museum exhibition. And it's something that we will continue to do. And so look forward to something different each year, someone different. So for this year's iteration, we're featuring the work of Akea Brionne, and Akea is the perfect Venn of our collecting interest because she's a graduate of the Cranbrook Academy of Art and also a Detroit-based artist, and those are the 2 major collections that we maintain here at the museum. Akea is a 2023 graduate of the photography department at the Academy. And Akea Brionne, A Dreaming Hour, is the artist's first solo museum exhibition and the 4th installment in our Fresh Paint series, which highlights recent work from Detroit area contemporary artists. Brionne's work has been exhibited at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Welland Museum of Art, and the Mississippi Museum of Art. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2024, the Gilda Award in 2025, and the Art and Tech Fellowship of the United States Artist Project in 2025. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Hyperallergic, and Art News. And her next exhibition and project will be opening in October at the Mattress Factory, an alternative art space in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So if you're by, check it out. And then following the talk, Akea will be joined by Katy Kim, who's the Jeanne and Ralph Graham Curatorial Fellow here at the museum. Katy is concluding, her fellowship at the museum this summer. And while at Cranbrook Art Museum, she has co-curated the graduate degree exhibition of Cranbrook Academy of Art, the last iteration of that, as well as Laboratory Labyrinth, which are selections from the Cranbrook collection, which is on view right now, including Monumental Colors, which is also on view right now in Larson Gallery, which features the work of 3 painters, Cecily Brown, Sam Gilliam, and Joan Mitchell. And in Detroit, well, if that wasn't enough work, she's been busy around the city. She was the visual arts curator of the Detroit Warehouse Art and Design Fair in 2025. And her latest curatorial project is being featured at Middle Gray, which is a new space in Little Village on the east side of Detroit, near the Shepherd. So it would be a good reason to check out that space, created by another Academy graduate, also from photography. So you don't always get to go inside of it, but now we have a good reason to go in because of the exhibition. And that exhibition is called One Time at a Day, a solo exhibition of recent work by Academy graduate Daniel Rebar, who's also another photography graduate from the Academy. In addition to all these other endeavors, she's also a critic and has written for the Brooklyn Rail and 60 Inches from Center. And we are certainly looking forward to see what happens next in Katy's career. So please help me welcome Akea Brionne.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So I am going to just be walking through a little bit of the background of my work. It's not often that I get to sort of talk about the context and what actually led to the work that you see upstairs. So today I am going to be talking a bit about my own personal history and then the sort of transition from photography to textiles, and also incorporating artificial intelligence and other aspects of technology. So I also want to just quickly take a moment to just acknowledge a lot of the weather that has been happening. I'm so glad that the air has cleared, but I do want to just take a moment to acknowledge a lot of the destruction that's been happening across Ontario, primarily with tribal lands. So I think let's all just take a moment to have some gratitude for the weather, but also the fact that our homes have not been destroyed. So that's hopefully not too morbid to start off, but a lot of my work and a lot of the things that I explore in my work are really influenced by the relationship between people, places, and the history of those spaces. So I'm going to go into a bit of my background. So I like to say that I am a New Orleans-born, Baltimore-bred, and Detroit-based artist and researcher working at the intersection of lens-based media, textiles, and technology. Okay, so this is a lovely photo of me as a child in New Orleans. A lot of my work is really focused on my own personal history, being from New Orleans. We've got some family photos here of my family, and if you have never been to New Orleans, it is an absolutely magical and enchanting place. I talk often about the reality that Louisiana as a state had to be Americanized. We were not occupied under British rule, so a lot of the ways that the architecture is designed, a lot of ideas around race, the sort of level of free blacks in that society that was functioning is very much influenced by the fact that we were under Spanish and French occupation for a very long time. This becomes really important for me specifically because here we have an image of Fossenville. Just to get some context, how many people in the room have been to New Orleans? Okay, so a good amount of people. Is anyone from the South in here also? Okay, hey, okay, so good. So this is an image of Fossenville. Has anyone heard of this space before? So this is in New Orleans, and this is an image that is of where the land is. So this is where the Battle of New Orleans happens on the Chalmette plantation. After the Civil War, the plantation changed hands a number of times until around 1870, where it landed in the hands of Jean-Pierre Fossen, who was a free man of color. He eventually ended up selling these lots into sublots, and it became the first free settlement of African Americans within Louisiana at the time, and specifically New Orleans. And my family was one of the first families to settle in this land. Around the 150th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans and the end of the Civil War, the state and the city decided to essentially raise the lands by right of eminent domain, and ended up basically restoring the lands to the state of the Battle of New Orleans. And obviously that caused a lot of disarray for a lot of the families there, but for 100 years it was the first free settlement, and has a lot of history for my family in particular. There is an amazing story that was done by WLAE, which is New Orleans Public Television, and if you are interested in sort of diving a bit deeper into that history, I think it illuminates a lot of the sort of the concept of a forced migratory pattern that has been happening across the states, but especially in Louisiana. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. At the time, I was 8 years old. It was, at that point in time, the third strongest hurricane to hit the United States and was known for having sustained winds at 175 miles per hour. During that storm, about 1,800 lives were lost and over 1 million people were displaced across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. My grandmother's side of the family and both my grandfather's side of the family are from Louisiana and Mississippi, so as you can imagine, it was a complete devastation for every aspect of my family. None of us really left the South during the Great Migration, so a lot of my work looks at the the aftermath of what happened to a lot of Black, Southern, rural communities as a result of such a mass exodus, but also a lot of storms that were taking place in addition to Hurricane Katrina. So I, as a result, ended up relocating to the Maryland area, to Baltimore, Maryland. Has anyone been? Okay, amazing. Well, y'all are really well-traveled. So I ended up moving to the Baltimore area, but more specifically, before we moved to the city, I moved to a very small town called Ellicott City. Has anyone in here heard of it or been? Okay, amazing. So I'm just so happy with the audience today. So in Ellicott City, it is a nationally registered historic district. It was a town that was founded in 1772. It was established by a trio of Quaker brothers that had relocated from Pennsylvania to Maryland, and they were most known for, at the time, which was a very distinct approach to farming, which utilized fertilizers. So it actually contributed to a lot of the expansion of agriculture. I'd say when I was growing up, it was often joked about that anyone who was from Ellicott City were just a bunch of farm kids, because outside of this, it was essentially nothing but cornfields. But a lot of my formative years happened in this town. Obviously, I relocated from New Orleans, and when I relocated, I was really struggling with having to encounter the issue of water yet again, and really the increase of storms. So this is an image from a storm that happened and completely sort of destroyed a lot of aspects of our town. The town is located on, it's often said that it's located next to the Patapsco rivers, but it is actually located on top of the rivers. So as the storms have increased over the years, as you can see underneath of these buildings, that this is where the water runs through. So all of the buildings are built on top of this river. And as the floods have gotten more intense over the years, the bottoms of the structures have started to cave out and wash away. There have been over a dozen major floods throughout the 250 years of the town. Some of the most notable hurricanes in particular are Hurricane Agnes, which hit in 1972, and Hurricane Eloise, which hit just a few years later in 1975. And then there was the Great Flood of 1868, which occurred when the Patapsco River rose to 21 feet and killed 43 people. In my lifetime, I've experienced 3 catastrophic floods in my town. The first being in 2006, when I was 9 years old, just a year after Katrina. The second being in 2011 when I was 15, and then in 2016 when I was 20 years old. you can sort of see how intense the water gets. It's gotten incredibly high, and I grew up looking at the markers of how high the water has gotten over the years. But this is, I was going to say it's a great image. It's not a great image, but it is definitely an example of a lot of what I was working through during some really formative years of having to deal with a lot of destruction at the hands of the environment changing and the storms getting more intense. This is an aerial view of the town, but you can sort of see how it's surrounded by the water. After I guess I was still sort of aging, but around 17, I was like, I have had enough, and I would like to move. So I applied for a scholarship program at an arts boarding school in Napa Valley, and 3 days before I was set to start my senior year of high school, I found out I got a full scholarship, and so I packed a suitcase and I moved across the country to Napa Valley. So absolutely gorgeous, right? I thought that I was escaping some destruction, but it was a really interesting space that reconnected me to this understanding of landscape, but also the way that the landscape that you're in is only as permanent as the earth really wants it to be. I went to a school which is now closed, but the Oxbow School in Napa Valley. So we were basically centered around just making art and sort of having philosophical discussions about Henry David Thoreau and what it means to be in solitude with nature and all of that good jazz. It is named the Oxbow School because it is situated off of an oxbow, which is basically a curve in a loop that is crafted by the water. So as it meanders, it sort of cuts through the land and ends up looping back around to itself. And you are left with this sort of body of land in the center of those loops. So I moved to this landscape, and you can see the view from one of the studios. It was absolutely gorgeous. But at that point in time, I was really starting to gain a sense of home, but in a completely different landscape. And around this time, I experienced my first intense earthquake, which was the 2014. Oh my God, these gasps. Yes, but this was the 2014 6.0 South Napa earthquake. And not long after that, I started experiencing my first wildfires. So this was a complete it was a different way of dealing with destruction. Most of my life had been centered in sort of losing homes, but through the force of water and through this experience, it was fire. So I was really, really trying to figure out really how to have a stable sense of self and a stable sense of home when the majority of my formative years was really navigating through all of my homes, really being heavily impacted by the environment. This ended up with me having a really deep interest in the concept of embodied geography, which focuses on how the body experiences, remembers, and carries places. I was also really thinking about my own experience moving across the country and started to become really interested in this term, which the UN Refugee Agency refers to as IDP. So this is internally displaced people, which are people who have been forced to flee their homes by conflict, violence, persecution, or disasters, but they are still remaining within the borders of their own country. So a lot of what I was working through at that time was really trying to figure out how to make sense of myself as someone who felt very much like an internally displaced person, sort of moving from place to place and dealing with sort of the constant threat of the weather. So this sort of led me into thinking more intensely about my own personal lineage and my own personal migration, though all of the spaces that I showed before were spaces that were my homes and were spaces I was living during my formative years. My family was not from any of those spaces. So on top of dealing with a lot of the environmental aspects of destruction and trying to rebuild consistently, it left me extremely confused about who I was culturally and ethnically as well. I'm obviously from New Orleans, which is a very rich space culturally, but I am also a very proud Creole woman, which is just, I like to say, a product of all of the imperial forces of the world, a product of French and Spanish and indigenous and West African cultures. So I started thinking about what it meant for my family to have migrated in ways that maybe weren't as environmentally charged as mine, but still left them in a space of having to rebuild again and again. So just to give a bit of a background, my family has emigrated from Belize on my dad's side. It is, if you aren't aware, situated just under Mexico to the left of Guatemala and above Honduras. About 43.7% of the population in Belize is mixed with Mayan and European descent, which is also easy to sort of just put in terms of mestizo identity. About 30% of the country is African or Afro-European Creole ancestry, and about 11% are Mayan and 6.6 are Afro-Amerindian, so thinking about the Garifuna culture. Most people are really aware of Belize with the beautiful beaches and pristine, the sky is just an absolutely beautiful space. But I am very aware of the immense cultural impact that the landscape has had across the world and the globe, most presently with a lot of the Mayan and indigenous culture that is still very much embedded into the landscape. And so I've been thinking a lot about what these spaces meant and what resilience and sort of working through a different set of challenges, but how that sort of fed me with a certain level of resilience. This is my papi, so my great-great-grandfather, who was sort of the first person to leave Belize on my dad's side of the family, and ended up migrating to New Orleans, where my dad and his siblings and my grandparents were born and raised. But they didn't speak much English, so a lot of it is very broken patois, and a lot of Brazilian Creole. And then my grandfather's side of the family was from Columbus, Mississippi. Has anyone been there or heard? I would be so shocked. Wow, okay. Okay, you two over there are. So, Columbus, Mississippi, it is located in the northeast corner of Mississippi. It's just off of the Tombigbee River, and it is 9 miles from the state line of Alabama. So actually it was technically considered to be Alabama until 1821, which became very important when we started to do our own work in terms of our ancestry, because we were trying to find information in the Mississippi census, but a lot of information was spelled phonetically. So it was not until we remembered that we were actually able to trace some history back to Alabama. But I spent a lot of time in these spaces growing up, but the weird sort of wrench in all of that is that my mother was born and raised in New Mexico. So my grandfather was one of the physicists who was working on the atom bomb out in Los Alamos. pretty crazy conversations to have with him. But it was a really fascinating sort of diversion that created a really rich palette of landscapes for me to pull from, not just in my own personal life, but these are the landscapes that my mother and my grandparents were really having their formative years. Both of my grandparents moved to New Mexico in the 20s, or not the 20s, in their 20s, which was around the 1970s. So my grandfather was doing a lot of this work, and as a result, a lot of my life, I have spent a lot of time in New Mexico, and I've gained a lot of influences from this landscape and from a variety of the cultures. At that time in 1970, this is a photo of my grandparents on the right, my mother's parents. They are very much so divorced and very much so do not like each other that much anymore, but I love this image. At that time in 1970, the population in Albuquerque was roughly around 245,000 people, and out of that ratio, only 2% of the population was African American. So that becomes roughly about 5,000 to 7,000 people, or 1,500 to 2,100 households. My grandfather often reminds me that when he was working at the lab, he was one of only 17 Black scientists working. So, of course, this really created a massive sort of emphasis on really having experiences where you are culturally isolated at numerous points throughout my lineage, at least in recent years. My name in particular is really influenced by indigenous culture, both with the influences in Creole culture, but also as a result of much of my family spending the latter half of the last century in New Mexico. So this is actually an image. My name is from the Kiowa tribe, and they are the Plain Indians of Oklahoma. So this is actually, I like to call her the first Akea. So she's on the left. My name means a nice walk, and she's photographed here with her father, Elk Tongue of the Kiowa tribe. This was photographed in 1891. And so this is just a way to sort of help you understand a little bit of the basis of what I was really thinking about and sort of consumed in when I started making my work as an artist. Often I get a lot of questions about if I've done anything else or when I knew I wanted to be an artist. I've literally never done anything else. I was the kid who passed out in gym class, so I literally could do nothing other than draw and make art. And so that sort of gets into my foundation a little bit. As mentioned, I did get my MFA here at Cranbrook in photography, but I also did my dual degree in undergrad at Maryland Institute College of Art in photography and humanistic studies, with a focus on critical race theory, French feminist, and trans feminist theory. And there's a lot of, I think, misinformation around critical race theory, but just for the point of this talk, it was really looking at the relationships between the social concepts of race and ethnicity and how it actually impacts the laws that are made as well as mass media, and is really rooted in trying to get people to understand that certain experiences are really shaped by the laws and structures in place, not just people's perception or opinions. So a lot of the work that I was doing at that point in time was looking at this sort of performative aspect of sort of thinking about myself in relation to a lot of the communities I was around, which were primarily white, and I was really trying to make sense of myself in these spaces. So I was taking a lot of self-portraits and sort of posing in front of these textiles, which were from a textile collection titled the Vintage Americana Collection. And so you can see a lot of the images are really indicative of certain individuals, but I was really trying to sort of interrogate that a little bit more deeply with these sets that I was producing. I was working really intensely with performance and movement and thinking about the ways that I was sort of introduced my somatic body practice. So really thinking about the ways that you are, your body sort of carries a lot of your trauma, but also movement and a lot of your experiences. And then I started photographing the landscapes of my home. I was at that time living just outside of Baltimore, and I was really interested in trying to look at photographing these landscapes that I felt a lot of Black Americans are often not considered to be existing in, but I was fairly isolated within this space that was outside of the city, but incredibly rural, and honestly left me nothing to do but look at the sky and ruminate on all of the ways I did not feel sort of rooted in the culture of these landscapes. So I'll just share some of those images. Just to keep in mind, before I got to the textiles, I was working exclusively with photography. So this is a lot of what I was exploring at that moment. And I was really focused on the landscape and the spaces around me, less so on the people. But in April of 2015, when I was back in the city of Baltimore, there was the death of Freddie Gray. He was 25 and was arrested by the Baltimore police, and while in police custody, sustained injuries that essentially broke his spine while in the van, and it ended up sort of ballooning into the uprisings in Baltimore at the time. So just to give some context, at this point in time, I was 18 and I was living 7 blocks away from where this started. It was an incredibly transformative experience and time for me, where I was constantly surrounded by a different level of civil unrest. Before, it had been really influenced by a lot of what was happening environmentally, but this was the first time that it was really social and political, and so it felt like a different type of it had a different type of energy, and I would say that experience definitely completely reshaped the focus of my work. That was also the time where the National Guard was deployed and the entire city was under martial law. And it was a very, very disorienting experience to see how the media was portraying what happened versus how we were actually experiencing it on the ground, and the very blatant lies that were being told about certain events that happened that day, as a lot of us were there and seeing a lot of it unfold. So this sort of really reshifted my thinking around what I wanted to do with my work and how I wanted the impact of my practice to sit. And it also really made me reframe what photography meant and the role of photography, especially with thinking about the power that it has to persuade mass audiences. So this sort of shifted my focus, and I started to create a series titled Black Picket Fences. So this was my senior thesis project for undergrad. It was my first project working digitally, so I'd only been working with really analog photography prior to that point. And I decided to sort of think about what I wanted to display, and I wanted to really focus on sort of giving a different perspective of Black life in America. So I started photographing my family and family friends and connections throughout the South. So Maryland is considered to be technically a part of the South. The Mason-Dixon line runs straight through Maryland. So we are technically the northernmost southern state and the southernmost northern state, which puts it at a very interesting space geographically. But I was really trying to show a lot of the contemporary landscapes of not just Black Southern landscapes, but also the interior landscapes of homes. It became really apparent to me during these situations with the uprisings that a lot of people were really unfamiliar with Black life that wasn't depicted in either hip hop or wasn't really focused on ideas of poverty or mass incarceration. And so I was really focused on thinking about the home and the ways that you can you can sort of shift people's ideas of what spaces can be and how they exist. I started to sort of shift this, and I turned the lens back on my family at this point in time and started to go back to self-portraits. I was working a lot with collodions or tintypes, and that was the first time that I really started thinking more intentionally about creating a visual archive rather than just preserving one. So while I was doing so, I was also really confronted with the limitations of photography as well as the bias and a lot of the lack of developments that had happened in terms of the chemistry in particular and the ways that it was still really inaccurate in terms of representing Black skin in particular. This is a great example. On the left, this is an image of Frederick Douglass, and this was photographed in 1855. And on the right, there is a daguerreotype of Renti Taylor, who is one of the first slaves to ever be photographed. He worked on a cotton plantation, but was originally from the Congo Basin. So his photograph is very impactful, primarily because he was not born into slavery, but did come over, was impacted, obviously, by the slave trade, and was one of the first individuals to experience that, to actually be captured and documented in an image. This is a great quote by Frederick Douglass titled, it reads, "It is evident that the great cheapness and universality of pictures must exert a powerful, though silent, influence upon the ideas and sentiment of present and future generations." So he was someone who was very, very interested in photography and was an admirer of Louis Daguerre, who invented the daguerreotype. And he was often interested in celebrating the possibility of photographs being something that could reshift people's ideas around African Americans in this country. And so he actually is he is the most photographed person in the 19th century. I think by the end of his life, there were around 166 photographs of him. So he intentionally reached out to photographers to try and make sure that throughout his life, he was getting as many documents as possible of himself as an upstanding, respectable person. And this was something he did very intentionally to try and shift the narrative of African Americans, which at this time with the collodion, they were primarily only capturing Blacks as slaves at this point in time, as you saw with the Renti Taylor. So a lot of my work at this time was really thinking about the fact that I had spent so much of my time in my youth sort of uplifting this medium that I felt was incredibly deceptive and wasn't really accurately sharing a mass portion of a lot of people, and not just African Americans, but I was thinking really intentionally about how I wanted to sort of talk about that conversation. And it brought me to the realization that photography has always been manipulative. And I was working through this because at the time, as someone who was trained in art school and sort of my whole community was centered around art, there was often a lot of conversations around the hierarchy of different mediums, and photographers were often in this space where we still had to defend the fact that we were artists. And as a result, we also had to sort of do a lot of work with not having our work always be sort of perceived as factual or truthful. So I'm just going to share a few images. This is from the Rijksmuseum at Amsterdam. They did an exhibition which closed in May, and it looks at over 50 photographs, all made before 1940, that were made and manipulated with tools, obviously, before Photoshop and artificial intelligence. So you can see here, this is an image of Colorado Springs, which was sort of constructed for the Detroit Publishing Company. But you can see the ways that a lot of the negatives are sort of being composed from different images. And so I'm just going to share some of these sort of fun, I guess this beheading isn't fun, but just the way that a lot of photographers prior to a lot of the sort of digital tools that we have now, we're manipulating images and sort of creating a different idea of not only artistic creation, but also thinking about the way that a lot of these images have been used to record moments in history. Is anyone familiar with this image? So this is an image of General Ulysses S. Grant. This is technically supposed to be a photo of him at City Point, but it's actually composed of 3 different images, including the background landscape, which was not actually City Point, and the body. So his head was placed onto the body of the form on the horse. I think this is one of the most famous examples, which is this image of Abraham Lincoln, where his body was put on, or his head was put onto the body of John Calhoun. They thought that he didn't really look heroic enough, so they put his body, or his head, onto another body. But at this point in time, I was really sort of fed up with photography, and I then had an opportunity when I was commissioned for the show, A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration. And for this show, I decided to explore photography in terms of textiles. So this is actually when my work decided to sort of shift. At this point in time, I was really unsure of how I wanted to proceed in terms of using photography as my main medium, but I was also working on a short film at the time where I went back to Mississippi with my grandfather and went through the house that he was born and raised in. In this house, we found a box of photographs that had been taken of my family across Mississippi. So these are some of the most beautiful photographs that show just some of the sort of slow beauty and joy that was existing at this time in rural southern Mississippi. A lot of my work is focused on the opportunities as a result of the women in my family. So these are the 4 Brown sisters, so my great-great-grandmother and her 4 sisters. And so you see a lot of these images. I started to play around with them digitally, but I was not completely sure of how I wanted to pursue the photograph on fabric, but I became really interested in working with these woven images. So you can see here, these are the jacquard textiles, which at that point in time, they weren't stretched, but I'm just going to give a brief history on the jacquard loom. So it was invented by Joseph Marie Jacquard. This is an image that was woven on silk of him. This is the original loom. So there are some earlier images of the loom, and you can see here, this is an image of punch cards, which are used on the hand loom. And this is another image. And here we also have a beautiful pattern book. So this is from around 1840, but you can see these are some of the jacquards that were being created by the loom at that point in time, which are, they actually feel really contemporary. But I became really interested in the translation of imagery from obviously analog and film photography, then digitally, and then of course to the loom. So here are some larger images of the jacquard loom. And you can see the scale is pretty large, and they required multiple people. This is more of a contemporary loom, but I'm just going to share a quick video so that you can see what the process looks like.
Nestled beautifully in the Norwegian woods, an hour's drive away from the capital Oslo, is a small factory that makes big things. Established over 40 years ago, Trondrud Engineering has, over the years, designed, manufactured, and delivered close to 6,000 products and solutions in the industrial automation segment. And one of these products is the digital jacquard loom, called the TC2, handled by the company's subsidiary, Digital Weaving Norway. Made with some of the most advanced technologies by people who have a passion for detail, this is a design tool for the creative phase of making textiles. Textiles are everywhere. You can see, touch, feel them. You can even make them do things. But behind any experience that you envision for a textile to evoke, there's an idea, a process, and a means to take you there. That's where the TC2 loom comes in. It is a rapid prototyping tool that significantly simplifies the design process, taking you from an idea to woven hard copies in minutes. It brings sampling or product development out of the production setting into the maker's workspace, enabling ideas to flow and materialize without interruptions.
Prototyping is necessary because weaving consists of combining materials, colors, and weave structures. Even the most experienced designer would not know the answer until you can touch it and feel it as a fabric. In traditional handlooms, there was always something left that couldn't be visualized. Now, with a rapid prototyping tool like the TC2, R&D labs and product development studios can work much more intuitively and develop designs more rapidly.
The TC2 technology is basically computer control of patterns, where every pixel in the pattern is mapped to a thread in the fabric. The starting point is to digitize what you want to weave in a design program. This could either be on a Photoshop or any industrial jacquard program. You then assign colors and weave structures, and the pattern is ready to be tested. The computer even allows for rethinking of the actual weave constructions to make them more in tune with the weaver's ideas. The hand weaving feature enables the user to engage actively in the making process. Every single pick is closely monitored as the fabric comes to life. And, if need be, parameters like warp densities, weft materials, weave structures, textures can be changed instantly. The TC2 is designed to offer creative freedom. It handles all traditional materials like silk, cotton, wool cashmere, and the likes. We also have customers working with more unconventional fibers, with new physical properties: fishing line, surgical steel wire, copper wire, electrical cords with different coatings, reflective and ultraviolet yarns, carbon fibers, to name a few. The TC2 loom frame comes in 3 sizes, and inside these frames are modules. The placement and the number of these modules determine the weaving possibilities. On the TC2, you can weave fabrics up to 56 inches or 145 centimeters and achieve warp densities up to 180 ends per inch or 72 ends per centimeter. The TC2 also enables direct control over 10,000 threads, offering endless design possibilities. Its ergonomic design and sophisticated user interface make the loom a high-precision tool, which is pure joy to work on. It even has an IP address, which means, if need be, Our technicians can provide service and support remotely, and with a substantially smaller footprint as compared to traditional jacquard looms, the TC2 fits right into the designer's workspace. From a material artist to a material scientist, the TC2 is for anyone who's creative and curious. Artists and craft weavers is a segment that we've been in awe of for the manner they've used the loom to translate their ideas into woven art. TC2s are also at educational institutions, helping students learn about fiber arts as well as textile technologies. Another emerging segment is Fab Labs, maker spaces and innovation labs, where the loom is being used to test new materials and their properties. Textile manufacturers use it to prototype apparel, interiors, footwear, and smart textiles. For us, though, this loom has given us a sense of belonging, of being a part of a community of sorts, with those passionate about textiles sharing experiences.
Okay, so we learned what we need to learn from them. Okay, so I wanted to just share that primarily because I think the history of the loom is really undervalued and really isn't known that well, but it is actually the basis of all modern computers. So this is a portrait of Charles Babbage, who was a mathematician who created the analytical engine. So this basically is the idea that you could sort of code an engine and tell it how to conduct a program, which of course was modeled after the punch cards. So this was sort of thought, he had used this to experiment with calculations, but this was pushed forward by Ada Lovelace, who said the analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. So you actually start to see the way that as computers and technology expands, it is all sort of expanding on this idea that you can basically tell a program, or you can sort of code a program, tell a computer what to do, and it can also memorize that program. So we don't think about these things as much now because it's developed so fast, but all of this was based off of a very simple development in the jacquard loom, where these punch cards memorized weaving patterns that traditionally our human minds would have had to memorize all of those. So this sort of brought me into this exploration into the relationship between both my work and technology, but also this aspect of technology as something that I could use as a tool within my work and sort of push a little bit further. These are some of the questions created by Dan Masterson, who's sort of thinking about the relationship of technology and spirituality. But I really started confronting this when I tried to create my own images with AI and translate those images, and also work on images that were sort of renders of my imagination that I would have historically had to digitally collage. But I started to find a lot of bias within the AI programs themselves. So these are some of the first images that I was rendering, and a lot of them pull from very outdated and racist stereotypes created around the mammy. Now, I did not put in any of that information. I was actually trying to render an image of myself from my home in New Orleans in the kitchen, which had these checkered floors. So it got the checkers right, but it was very, very off with the bodies and the figures. And I started really trying to figure out how to work past these distortions that it was having with the figure, but also these really sort of aggressive renditions of Black women in particular. So I sort of had to train myself and train the server on how to sort of use language in a way that wasn't rendering certain body or certain individuals with such negative stereotypes. So this sort of prompted my research into this, and I was using my image to sort of research this, and I started to get some really weird renderings. They're just very uncanny and like a little off-putting, but it started making me think really intentionally about surrealism. So Afrosurrealism in particular is an artistic and literary movement that explores Black life through the strange, uncanny, dreamlike, and spiritually charged, not as an escape from reality, but as a way of revealing realities that conventional realism can't fully express. So I started to look at this much more intentionally, and I was trying to figure out how to render this through my textiles. So you can see sort of how with this AI server, I started working with a private AI server. So it's basically only for the past almost 5 years now, it's been working just on the images that I am feeding it. So it's based off of my photographs I've taken of myself, photographs of my family, landscape images, and also the work that I have created goes back into the AI server. So it's constantly rebuilding on this repository. So you can sort of see here in this image, I worked on this self-portrait in the left, and it is one of the base images to build one of my textiles, and you can see how a mask that I've created actually ends up evolving into these really exaggerated features. Even the elongated neck, it's sort of reading this from the stacking of these beads, which are my childhood Mardi Gras beads. And so I really started to push those elements of surrealism within the textiles, and I was still thinking about ideas of migration, identity, all of the things we've sort of discussed, but I was trying to not focus on it needing to make sense to other people and sort of bringing together all of these worlds and landscapes and also these forces of nature that were sort of compounding into a lot of really intense dreams and sometimes nightmares that I was having about some of the experiences that I'd had. I love this quote by Harriet Beecher Stowe saying that dreams are the hushing of the bodily senses that the eyes of the spirit may open. So I was thinking about this a lot in terms of creating this dream world, but also world building as a continuous practice within my work where I'm going deeper into my dreams and sort of starting to manifest these landscapes through these textiles. So this is sort of where we get to the show that's on V right now with A Dreaming Hour. It's sort of a culmination of all of these landscapes and all of these stories and images and these dreams and sometimes nightmares that I have had of these landscapes. And so it's sort of a piecing together of all of these spaces and these homes. And so it started as these digital renders. These are sort of the final images, and then obviously it sort of manifests in the work that you see upstairs. But as you can see, these are literally just digital renders. It's not what the final work looks like, but it gives me a good idea of what the textile will look like once it's complete. But you can sort of see some of the ways that the sort of base foundation for a lot of these images and the positions are coming from a lot of these archival images. This is just an image from my short film where we were going through some of the homes in Mississippi. But you can sort of see the way that these landscapes and the foliage starts to really creep into these textiles and starts to create sort of the foundation of this world that we're building in this dream landscape. This is one of the larger pieces in the show upstairs, but this was for me a time to really think about what could happen when you sort of allow your subconscious landscape to manifest in reality, and also how that intersects with the ways that I can explore that with textiles and pushing this with technology. So all of the work gets adorned with glitter, it gets adorned with oil pastels and rhinestones, and the pieces are sometimes stuffed, so the forms will physically sort of come out, and it's almost like they're breathing and living. And so you get to experience not only the culmination of all of these spaces and the themes that I'm thinking about, but also literally the transition of my sort of exploration from photography to textiles, to the tech side with the loom and the artificial intelligence, and it's all sort of coming together into one piece of, well, I guess a large body of work that sits at the intersection of, I think, very futuristic and very contemporary mediums like the digital side and the artificial intelligence, but speaks to these really key moments in history. You'll see in my work a lot of the figures are sometimes very stoic, and a lot of them are pulling from also the rigidity that had to take place within a lot of collodion photographs in particular. So you'll see a lot of those positions repeating. And this is another base image for some of these. So you'll see the ways it's not an exact rendering, but you can start to identify how a lot of the figures and the positions of the subjects in particular are sort of being built from these images. So that's all I'm going to ramble at you about today, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for being here today with us. Can we have another round of applause for Akea? That was really incredible. So something I just want to underscore that Andrew mentioned is that this is all new work that Akea made when I first asked her to do this show last year. So this is really quite an achievement. And before we really get into it, I think there's a lot to talk about. I was curious just to hear how you're personally feeling, and now that you've hopefully had a moment to rest, how you feel about this new body of work.
Yeah, I feel really good about this body of work. These are the largest pieces that I have made so far, aside from a piece downtown at the Hudson, which is 30 feet wide, so it's much wider. But these are the largest sort of singular pieces that I've made, as well as I think the most expansive in terms of them also being the only pieces that I've ever framed. So the frames were sort of built and constructed in the space, and I've also introduced a lot of mixed media elements as well as oil pastels. So yeah, it's been really good.
So I think just hearing your presentation, it's really interesting to me just to hear how rooted your background is in photography. I know you continue to kind of name yourself as a lens-based photographer, and kind of thinking about your history from photographs to textiles. I'm curious, beyond working in this generative AI server, how do you see the photograph kind of continuing to show up in this body of work?
Yeah, well, I think I enjoyed getting to share some of the archival images. My grandfather was actually unaware that those images were taken, so I actually found those when we were wandering around the house and down in Columbus. And this house was it was the house that he was raised in, as well as his mother, and her father was born into slavery, was freed, purchased this land and built this house. So the fact that I was able to discover this box of photos from this time that really documented sort of the lineage of a very particular aspect of my family was something that I really enjoy. And so I think for me in particular, being able to see the connection of these images and the ways that the figures sort of carry themselves and the landscapes are constructed, it feels for me like a full circle moment around the possibilities of photography that I think are often, for a lot of people, really confined to just clicking the shutter and then printing it on a piece of paper. So for me, this has been a really great example of sort of showing the possibilities of what image making can do, especially as technology continues to expand.
Yeah, and I think something that's really important to drill down in your process is that this is a private AI server. And from what I remember you saying, it's 5,000 images, which is really quite immense. I know you mentioned it took you years to kind of build this up. So it's striking to me that you're also kind of creating your own archive. Like you're working from an archive, but of course, the images that you're generating are, building new landscapes and figures, again, from that body of work. And I just want to also drill down your process. So you're starting with this private AI server, you're generating your compositions, and then afterwards, those compositions are getting fabricated using the digital loom in the jacquard material. And something that I think is super important about the jacquard is that the image is actually being woven like a pixel into the warp and weft of the textile. And finally, of course, the work becomes really textile oriented, where you're applying all of this glitter and you're making your own frames. And I just want you to talk a little bit, if you could, about the labor, like what happens once you receive that, the jacquard.
Yeah, I feel like the labor, it's one of those things that I'm still contending with, because I think a lot of the, not just for myself, but I think the labor of a lot of artists is incredibly undervalued. I think the productions and the creations of artists are valued, but the time that it takes to not only make them, but to also know how to make things, and the years it takes to know how to do something quickly is something that I feel is really undervalued, and it's something that has made me think really intentionally about also the lack of understanding around the arts as a legitimate career. I have so many friends who actually they don't realize that this is what I do all day, which is actually really funny. Or not in a way, but I think it's something that it sort of makes me think about all of the different processes that I'm using as well. So it actually is starting with the photographs. It's always starting with a photograph, and I used to do a lot of the collaging myself through Photoshop, which is just a ton of individual layers. You can have hundreds of individual layers that you have to sift through sometimes if you are literally world building to the extent that some of these images are. So a lot of the time is really a period of weeks and months happens of rendering the images and working on the collages and world building digitally. Once I figure out what the composition is and what I like in terms of the image, sometimes I might change the color. I might change the color palette. I might expand the scale. But I always have to be thinking about how it's going to translate to the loom. So even with this image here, the sort of wider piece, it is to the left of the frame here. It is 12 feet wide, but it is composed of 3 individual panels, which are each 4 by 5 feet. So I actually can't work on any of these pieces at the scale that you see. So none of these works are, I don't actually get to see them as finished pieces. I'm only seeing the individual panel that I'm able to work on. So I also have to spend a lot of time sort of translating the image to the scale that it's going to be when it's printed. And then I have to translate the image, as you saw in the video, into pixels and basically get all of that properly pixelated and coded to go to the loom. So there's actually a lot of labor before I even get to the physical labor. And again, that's a process of weeks and months. And then once the work is sort of through the loom, I get my individual panels back from the weaver. I then stretch them onto canvas. Some of them are stuffed with polyfill, so doll stuffing or like pillow stuffing. They are sort of stitched directly onto the canvas. So I like to use the analogy of like a harp player. So you have the harp in between your legs. For me, that is the canvas, so I have to literally sit there in the chair, but sort of threading from front to back to get the pieces stitched to the canvas. And then I begin the work of starting with the glitter. It takes about 16 to 18 hours per layer for the glitter to dry. So I have to then sort of plan out not only the colors, but obviously if I start from the bottom of the piece and then I have to dump all the glitter off, everything that the glitter falls down onto would obviously start to adhere. So in order to not have the colors bleed and to actually have a visible image rather than just a bunch of colorful glitter, I have to be strategic about working from top to bottom, from left to right, from fine grain to sort of heavier grains. And then I have to wait for each layer to dry, which I said is about 16 to 18 hours. And if there are thicker pieces of glitter, it could take about 2 to 3 days for some pieces that are sort of painted on and are a little bit more sculptural. So all of that is obviously quite a bit of time. And then I have to go in with the pastels and stitching on the individual foliage. And as I said, these pieces are extremely large in the sense that the frames really can't be fabricated in the studio. So those also had to be constructed in the space and built around the works once all of the panels were put together. So yeah, I like to say my 2-year-old is very aware of the time it takes because it's time he does not get with me. So it's a lot of time, a lot of labor.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that you're obviously, once you receive the fabric back, you're adding all of these treatments with your own hand. And glitter specifically, I don't know if everyone has seen the show yet. If not, you should absolutely see it afterwards because glitter is such a specific material and it does this incredible job of capturing the light and really kind of keeping a viewer in place. But it's also material that, I guess if you think art historically, like hasn't really been taken seriously. Often it's kind of relegated to this, side section of being craft, which has a lot of, gendered implications as well. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit how you see your relationship to that word of craft and again, the specificities of using glitter, and also what we see with some of the mixed media appliques on the work and a lot of the scalloped wood as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of associations with craft, and I think there's a lot of conversations that sort of are very demeaning in terms of the amount of labor that goes into the craft arts. I feel also like I've been extremely inspired by mediums that are relegated to conversations of craft and folk art because a lot of my influences, especially in Louisiana and New Mexico in particular, are anonymous weavers and potters and people making absolutely incredible things just for the home. I think of like the G's Bend quilters who, this was a group of women who were just making quilts for their families, for their homes, and for domestic spaces. And, it took a certain individual to see the value in those for other people to believe that there was value. So I think that the mediums that you choose can be really intentional, but I think I've always been really interested in trying to figure out how to make accessible materials seem more valuable than I think society has deemed them. Prior to working with the glitter, I was actually working solely with rhinestones, so I was hand jeweling every aspect of this. If you have ever seen some of my earlier work or the piece that was on display outside here for a while, there's a lot of jewels. So imagine all of the layers of the labor that I've explained, but think about me not glittering that and hand jeweling the work at this scale. It's actually pretty insane that that's what I was doing. So I guess you don't have to imagine. I mean, you might be able to see some of the work and see it. But I think a lot of ideas around craft hopefully are shifting. But I think I've been the most inspired by anonymous artists that would be considered to be crafters. And I think a lot of those mediums have also been historically sort of dominated by women. And so I've had a lot of conversations with myself about that history in particular, but just also as another background, my grandfather's second wife, who they were married before I was born, she was a curator at the Smithsonian. And when I was 18 and graduated high school, I started working at the Smithsonian, so the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, as a researcher. But growing up just across the Smithsonian museums in DC and growing up very intimately sort of involved within a very, I think it's, I mean, a literally dying population, but like a population that was really rooted in a very particular type of engagement with folk life in particular. I was constantly consumed in, I think, a lot of the realms of folk and craft art. That's all I was around. So I never really considered them to be craft. I just thought it was beautiful things that people were making.
Interesting. I feel like every time you talk, I always learn something different about your backstory. But I also feel like these categories of folk and craft art are also really interesting. And I feel like you touched upon this a little bit in your talk. When we think about this history of weaving, and specifically the jacquard loom, and having this idea of a textile prefiguring something that we consider to be very technologically innovative, being the computer from the punch cards. So that's just a really fascinating connection. And I guess with that, I'm curious if you could talk more about time and temporality, and how that kind of relates to Afrosurrealism, and how that shows up in some of the scenes that we have here.
Yeah, I think a lot of Afrosurrealism in particular sort of deals with this idea of time and the subconscious as something that I think is always existing. And a lot of it does relate to my interest and sort of my practice within spirituality, where a lot of it, not just in spirituality, but in a lot of belief systems across the world, especially within religious belief systems, all of it is rooted in faith. A lot of it is rooted in believing in things that you actually can never see or tangibly touch. And so I find that to be really interesting when thinking about surrealism. And sometimes I think the sort of Afro in front of it sort of makes people feel like it is solely about Black life, or that's all it can be about. But I think about someone like Frida Kahlo, who was working very intensely with what people call surrealism, but she was just making work about her life. She was making work about her experiences. And those experiences seemed really uncanny to a lot of people and still read that way. But a lot of it is really rooted in this idea of sort of acknowledging that for a lot of us, a lot of our connections to ourselves and the world around us is really informed by really intangible experiences. Our memories are some of the most intangible things that none of us can really touch or hold on to. And I remember learning that as they've studied the brain more, it's been understood that your memories are actually not even factual. They're not really trustworthy because you're only remembering the last time that you recalled that memory. And so we're always reconstructing, I think, these things that have sort of historically never really been questioned, or some people's memories haven't been questioned. But it brings this really sort of interesting conversation to play in terms of, like, what does it mean to sort of not hold on to things or not be able to sort of display something to someone or have someone understand an experience, but it's still very much real. So I think about that a lot with the surrealism.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if this is on. I think it's off. Yeah, and I think the last thing to say, I see Lila kind of creeping downstairs. But I think this this idea of surrealism, and I mean Afrosurrealism in particular, is the conceptual grounding of this show because so much of your work is drawing from memory, right? And when you think of a memory, you know, the time is not linear, it's circular, and this idea of circular timelines and narratives and drawing from the past and the present kind of destabilizes, you know, this kind of teleological view of linear time that I feel like is so embedded in, you know, Western art history. So it's really exciting to me that this body of work is drawing from your family's archive, but we can't quite tell where we're located in time. So maybe that's a good place to end before we take some questions from the audience. I think my mic has a dead battery. But the last thing to actually mention is that if you want to hear more about this exhibition and Akea's process, Akea's gallery, Library Street, will be publishing a monograph on her work that will be out August 29th. I have a curatorial essay in there so you could read further about time, temporality, Afrosurrealism, and Akea has also contributed writing, and that has a lot of detail images from the show, so I hope you'll keep an eye out for that. And it'll be available in the Cranbrook Art Museum shop. All right, I think we'll turn it over to questions.
All right, I have a microphone if anyone has a question. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'll bring it to you.
All right, I know there's a question in here somewhere and it'll manifest. First, I just want to say A+ on the fit check, you know. So the Jacquard has become really popular, as well as like some of the other kind of contemporary tools, AI and this sort of thing. And I'm curious. I don't know how to ask this question, but I listened to an artist talk, artist Holly Herndon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she is raising an AI on a private. It's a private AI. She's raising it as her child, essentially, so it can be ethical and make good decisions and not create the kinds of images that you showed us today. And you have a 2-year-old, but the AI that you're raising is 5, if I heard that correctly. And I'm interested in like the parallels, you know, and like raising a decent human against raising a decent tech, right? And I'm really interested in this like tech style, TECH style, right? Mm-hmm. Like in how, like what the parallels are, the similarities, the differences, and the responsibility as a maker, as a parent, as a, you know, an artist.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I feel like I honestly haven't thought much about the intersection between parenting my son, and I haven't thought about being the parent of this AI. I really think of my relationship with the server more as a collaborative relationship, like a creative collaborator. I feel like, for me, I'm not really interested in the sanctity of AI. I feel like I am someone who believes very strongly that I think AI is a reflection of humanity. We literally created it. And at this point in time, it is only aware of what humanity has already put out there. So I feel like you are sort of tasked with the same job that you are with a child, in a way, in the sense that my role with him is to give him the possibilities of what he can do and what he can sort of question and what he can ask and what he can be curious about. But it's not my job to control what that looks like. And I don't really think that's possible with AI. There are some things that I have to change physically in the images, some things, like some aspects of the images that I don't follow to a T. Because it does sort of do its own thing. But I think I'm really interested in sort of allowing that space to exist. Because I don't think I would want to keep another intelligence to the standards of human intelligence. Like our set of ethics and also my set of ethics would be totally different from your set of ethics versus Katy's set of ethics. And I think I sort of fall more in line of, I'm not really interested in AI trying to mimic humanity because it's not humanity. I think it's a product of humanity and I think it's a reflection of humanity, but it's not humanity. It's its own thing. And I think I'm fascinated also similarly in the sense that I look at my son, it's like, wow, I literally created this person, this living, breathing person that has his own thoughts and experiences. And I think I'm really excited for more of us as people to understand that that's what we did with AI. And at a certain point, I don't know if it's really, I don't know if there's much we can do about what AI might think or if it acts or operates in the ways that we deem ethically. I think it's really clear also that it doesn't have the same standards that we do and would make different decisions because it's not experiencing its existence in the same way. So it feels, for me, like I think about it and consider, are the images that I'm creating things that I feel comfortable and proud with putting out there. But as far as the AI itself, it's like I think it's going to do what it's going to do. And if I don't feel like I can answer for the things we collaborate on, outside of that, I don't know.
I think we'll take one more question before we close. All right, I'm coming back to you.
Thank you. Yes, and looking at your work, one of the things that comes to my mind is it's an exquisite form of visual poetry. But I'm also curious as to your family members, in which a lot of your work draws upon your family experiences. How did they react when they saw the manifestation of your work that was based upon the family memories?
Thank you for that question. So my family is very, very scattered, and I'm actually not very close with either of my parents. So actually none of my family has seen the show that's up right now. I think that's also part of time and aging. I was really raised by my grandfather and his brother and my grandmother and sort of their community. So a lot of them are no longer here. My grandfather is still here, and he did get to see the show for the Great Migration show. That is the second time I've seen him cry in his life. In his old age, he's gotten very emotional, but I think he's expressed being very impressed and being very proud, but I think more so for the sense that a lot of these spaces were inaccessible to him and his family, and a lot of the family that I'm making the work about and these images are from. When we were working on the film a few years ago, I remember going to do an interview with one of his childhood friends, and he dropped me off at the YMCA, and this is rural Mississippi, so there's not much else to do. But he drops me off, and I remember him saying, to let me know, like, tell me how it is in there, because he wasn't allowed to go into the YMCA when he was growing up. So I think a lot of what they have communicated is just like a sort of appreciation for, I think, finally being able to enter spaces that they weren't able to go into. And obviously not understanding it, like I come from a family of educators, my grandfather's a physicist, my uncle is an engineer. They have no idea how I became an artist. So I think, there's a curiosity, but I think that there's also, it sort of opened them up to a world that I physically wasn't possible for them, but I think conceptually, creatively, and also the fact that this is my career, I think it's very unfamiliar. So I think that they're sort of in a space of appreciation and awe. Aside from my uncle, who says he didn't consent to being a part of any of this, but he's still been a big supporter of mine. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to Akea and Katy. A Dreaming Hour by Akea Brionne is on view until September 6th. The galleries are still open for a few more minutes if you'd like to take a spin around before you head out. Thank you so much for being here.